Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. It was just before 6 in the morning, late October, and the city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, almost fragile, like the world is holding its breath. Central Park was mostly empty, except for the occasional early commuter or dog walker, and the air carried the smell of damp leaves and the faint tang of city exhaust lingering from the night before. My breath came out in small clouds as I started my usual loop, the soles of my sneakers crunching softly on the scattered leaves that coated the paths. The sky was a pale gray, with streaks of orange at the horizon, and the wind was still, brushing through the treetops in a slow, constant rustle. I passed the great lawn, which at this hour looked almost otherworldly. The grass was slick with dew, shimmering in the faint light, and the statues and benches appeared as shadowed silhouettes against the dim sky. That's when I noticed him. He was standing near the edge of the tree line, a man in a dark coat, completely still. I didn't recognize him, and at first I assumed he was just another early walker or someone waiting for a friend. He didn't shift his weight, didn't glance around. His posture was unnaturally rigid, almost deliberate, like he was holding himself in place. I told myself I was imagining it and kept jogging, focusing on the rhythm of my steps and the rise and fall of my breath. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then, as I rounded the path near the Upper West Side, I felt the faint but unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to convince myself I was wrong, and there he was again, just a few hundred feet behind, walking slowly, deliberately, keeping the same distance no matter how fast I went. My chest tightened, my pulse picking up. I slowed, testing the pattern, and he slowed too. My stomach nodded. This wasn't random. I wasn't imagining it. He was following me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was out for a morning run too. Maybe he had taken the same path coincidentally. But instinct gnawed at me. There was something off about him. The way he moved, or rather, the way he didn't move beyond the minimal effort to keep pace, felt calculated. There was no jitteriness, no casual glances, no small talk or motion that suggested he was just a passerby. He existed only in relation to me, and that was enough to make my skin crawl. I cut sharply through a side path, hoping to lose him, a narrower trail that wound through the trees, leaves damp underfoot and slick in spots. The world felt enclosed there, shadows stretching long and thin, the city muted beyond the tree line. I forced my legs to go faster, telling myself it was paranoia, that it had to be. Yet when I emerged near the reservoir, breath sharp in my chest, there he was again. 50 feet away, standing motionless, and yet the weight of his gaze felt heavier than the chill in the air. I froze for a moment, calculating. He didn't move toward me, not yet, but he didn't turn away either. Just watched. The reservoir stretched out before me, the water dark and still, reflecting the gray sky in a mirror like calm. Fog hovered low over the surface, curling around the edges where reeds and grass poked through. The path around it was mostly deserted, and I realized that if I kept running along the perimeter, I was completely exposed, no cover, no other people in sight for at least a quarter mile. My stomach churned. I knew I had to get to other people, somewhere crowded, somewhere visible. I picked up the pace again, forcing my legs to ignore the burning in my thighs, my lungs screaming with effort. He mirrored every motion, slowing when I slowed, not gaining or losing, just existing, tracking. I reached a point near the east side where a few early walkers had started to appear, bundled in scarves and jackets, their dogs tugging on leashes. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong I almost stumbled. I ran toward them, waving my arms and yelling in the low morning quiet. They looked up, startled, and I pressed on, urgency lending a kind of frantic energy to my movements. I glanced back once more, and he was still there, standing as if rooted to the ground, not pursuing, not reacting to the others, just staring in my direction. The look in his eyes was what made my stomach drop. It wasn't anger, or malice, or excitement. It was something quieter, more absolute. Focused. The kind of attention that feels like it can read everything you're thinking, everything you're about to do, and anticipate it. By the time I reached the group of walkers, I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen slightly, though my pulse stayed high. I slowed to a walk, trying to regulate my breathing, forcing my limbs to stop trembling. He didn't follow into the open area where the people were gathered. He stayed at the edge of the tree line, still watching until I slipped out of sight behind a curve in the path. I didn't look back again, not immediately. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone, checking the time, the map, the path I had just taken. Every small detail I had ignored in the past. The bends in the trail, the placement of benches, the gaps between trees, seemed vivid now, almost intrusive in memory. I stayed with other walkers for the next hour, slowly jogging in a small circle, never straying far from where the paths crossed and people were present. The chill didn't touch me the same way it had before. The city was starting to wake, traffic humming faintly, the occasional bicycle on the asphalt path. The sunlight was weak, but it began to illuminate the tips of the trees, the scattered leaves, and for a brief moment the park felt normal again, safe, reasonable. Even after I got home, showered, and tried to immerse myself in work, the memory stayed. I could see him clearly, the dark coat, the rigid stance, the eyes that didn't flinch, didn't blink in the way a normal person's eyes would when startled. The fact that he never approached once I was around others gnawed at me. It wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't even about pursuit. It was about presence, observation, the awareness that someone had decided, for reasons I couldn't understand, to focus entirely on me without needing to touch or speak or act beyond being there. Weeks later, whenever I passed that part of the park at any hour, the feeling returned, subtle at first, a prickle along the spine, a tightening in my chest, a reflexive glance over my shoulder. I learned to vary my routes, to keep to crowded paths in the early mornings, to never assume that a quiet park at dawn was entirely safe. The man never appeared again, not that I saw, but I knew he had been real, and that realization, the absolute certainty that someone could follow silently, invisibly tethered to your movements, was a weight that didn't lift. It changed the way I ran, the way I moved, the way I thought about empty spaces and quiet mornings. The park remained beautiful, crisp, and quiet, but for me it was never entirely the same. The moment of that early morning, the rigid figure in the gray light, stayed with me. A clear, undeniable memory that reshaped the way I moved through the world, aware that someone might always be watching, even when they didn't need to act. It was early November, and the days were already growing short, the kind of evenings where the air carries a quiet sharpness that makes you pull your jacket tighter without thinking. I had left work a little late, restless and needing to walk off the tension from staring at screens all day. Griffith Park had always been a kind of refuge for me, an expanse of trails and open spaces where the city noise softened, and I could feel some distance from everything pressing in at work and in life. By the time I parked, near one of the smaller lots at the edge of the park, it was around 8 in the evening. The sun had long since disappeared behind the hills, leaving a dim gray light that the street lamps barely touched, and shadows pooling under the trees like liquid darkness. I started down one of the paved paths that wound through the park, the surface cracked in places from years of neglect and lined with fallen leaves that rustled under my shoes. My breath was visible in short, quick bursts as I moved, and the quiet around me was deep, heavier than the usual city sounds I expected. Every so often, I passed someone walking a dog, usually moving at the edges of the paths, heads down, the dog sniffing along the perimeter of trees and grass. I didn't mind the few people I saw. They felt like markers, small reminders that I wasn't completely alone. Most of the park, though, was empty, and the vast spaces around me felt hollow in a way that made the hairs on my arms rise. I rounded a bend and came across a small playground, a relic of childhood in the middle of this wild expanse. The structures were simple: a slide, a set of swings, a monkey bar set. One of the swings caught my attention immediately. It was moving slowly, back and forth, its chains creaking in a rhythm that made me pause. I looked around instinctively. The wind had died down some time ago, leaving the air completely still, so the movement didn't make sense. At first, I thought perhaps a child had sneaked away, maybe playing hide and seek or trying to be funny. I stepped closer, my boots crunching over the layer of dry leaves, and called out softly, just in case someone was there. The swing kept moving, uninterrupted, and silence answered me. A subtle unease began to creep in as I lingered for a moment, studying the empty playground. Everything looked normal in the sense that there was nothing physically wrong. The ground worn from use, the paint chipped in places, but the emptiness of it, the way the swing moved by itself, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced down at my phone, flicking on the flashlight, and felt a small comfort in the narrow circle of light it cast across the ground. It was then that I heard it. A faint crunching, soft and irregular, like someone walking carefully over the leaves behind me. My body stiffened. I spun around quickly, expecting to see a jogger or someone walking a dog. But there was nothing there. No lights, no moving shadows, no figure. Just the gray dimness of the park under the faint glow of the street lamp. My pulse started to accelerate, and I felt that nervous heat that comes when your body senses something wrong before your mind can figure out what it is. I began walking faster, almost jogging, trying to convince myself it was nothing. That my imagination was getting the better of me after a long day at work and a long walk in the chill evening air. The swings creaked faintly behind me as I passed them, and for a moment, I caught the impression of movement in my peripheral vision. I froze, holding my breath, turning my head slowly, but the playground remained empty. I forced myself to take another step, then another, flashlight beam cutting through the dark as I tried to keep my nerves steady. As I moved down the path, I noticed a shadow shift near the edge of the playground, just beyond the slide. My heart jumped. There was a figure crouched low, pressed close to the ground as if trying to stay out of sight. I didn't get a clear look, but the shape was unmistakable. A human silhouette, hunched and still, almost blending with the darkness around the equipment. My instinct was to call out, to ask what they were doing, but my voice caught in my throat. There was a weight in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, and for a second, I considered turning back the way I came. Before I could react, the figure bolted. They sprinted past me, moving with a sudden speed that made my stomach drop, and vanished into the shadowed trees beyond the path. I didn't pause to see where they went. My legs took over without asking, my phone light bouncing across the ground as I ran faster than I had all day. Leaves and twigs snapped underfoot, my breath ragged, echoing faintly in the still night air. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to get away from whatever had just passed. The park stretched out around me, dark and unfamiliar, and the paths twisted in ways that felt different under the dim light. I didn't slow down until I saw the glow of my car in the distance. Relief hit me all at once, and my chest tightened as I fumbled with my keys, finally getting the door open and collapsing into the seat. My hands were shaking too much to start the engine immediately. I sat there, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that whatever it was had just been a person out for a jog, or someone trying to scare me for fun. But the crouched figure, the way they had moved, the way they had disappeared without a sound, it didn't make sense in any normal way. After a few minutes, I finally started the car and drove slowly out of the park, keeping my eyes on the road, but also scanning the shadows along the edge of the trail in case someone followed. Nothing appeared, and gradually, the tension in my chest eased, though my heartbeat stayed faster than usual for the next half hour. By the time I reached a more populated street, lined with shops and the faint hum of cars passing, the ordinary sounds of the city felt almost comforting. I thought about calling the police, but when I tried to explain what had happened, it sounded absurd even to me. A figure crouched behind a slide, then running into the dark, nothing stolen, no one hurt. It seemed impossible to describe without sounding paranoid. I decided instead to write it off as a coincidence, someone hiding for reasons I didn't understand, perhaps a lost teenager or a homeless person trying to stay out of sight. Even that didn't completely settle the unease, but it allowed me to function again. The next day, I returned to the same area of the park during daylight, walking slowly through the paths and checking the playground. Everything was quiet and empty, nothing unusual except for the leaves scattered across the ground. The swing was still, the metal frame gleaming in the morning sun. It all looked ordinary, normal, harmless. The fear from the night before seemed almost surreal under the daylight, and I realized that part of what had unsettled me. So much was not the figure itself, but the isolation, the emptiness, and the way the park transformed at night. I never saw anyone else in that area after dark again. I adjusted my routine, sticking to the trails during daylight and avoiding the quiet edges where shadows pooled. I never found out who or what had crouched behind that slide that night, and I never wanted to. It was enough to know that even in a familiar place, the world could feel different when the light changed, when the park emptied, and when you were left alone with your instincts. The memory stayed with me, a reminder of how ordinary places can feel dangerous and how quickly something that seems small, a moving swing, a shadow in the corner of your eye, can trigger the kind of fear that makes your whole body scream to get out. Even now, I sometimes walk past that playground during the day and glance at the swings, half expecting them to move on their own, and I can feel the shiver that came so easily that night. The fear was real, grounded entirely in the ordinary, the dark, the silence, the unknown person hiding in the shadows. It left me more cautious, more aware, and oddly grateful for the ordinary brightness of daylight when it came again. That night in Griffith Park reminded me that the world doesn't need monsters to be frightening. Sometimes it's the quiet spaces, the stillness, and the unknown that can make your instincts scream loudest. And that lesson stayed with me long after I finally drove away, safe in my car. I went running around Stowe Lake and Golden Gate Park at around 11:30 p.m. in late September. The air was damp and carried the faint smell of decaying leaves, and the fog hung low over the water, so thick that the lake itself was barely visible. Usually at that hour the park felt quiet but familiar. The distant hum of the city, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint shuffle of a late-night jogger. But that night, everything sounded muffled and unreal. My feet thudded softly against the damp path, the occasional crunch of wet leaves under my sneakers marking my progress. I had chosen this route because it was usually empty at night, a way to run without distractions. But the fog made even the familiar path feel alien. I was about halfway around the lake, moving at a steady pace, when I noticed a shape near the edge of the water. At first, I thought it might be a fisherman, though I didn't see any equipment. As I drew closer, I saw it was a man kneeling by the water, hunched over, dipping something repeatedly into the surface. The fog curled around him, blurring the outlines of his body and the object he held. He wore dark clothes, and I could barely make out the movement of his arms. The water rippled unnaturally around him with each motion, but it wasn't the usual gentle ripple of someone wading or fishing. I slowed, unsure whether I should approach or keep my distance. My curiosity mixed with a creeping unease as I tried to see what he was doing. The closer I got, the more I noticed the stillness of the park. There were no distant car horns, no murmuring voices from the trails. I couldn't even hear the occasional splash of ducks that normally dotted the lake. The fog swallowed sound like a thick blanket. The man's head was low, and his motions were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. I realized I was holding my breath. My mind raced through possible explanations. He could be cleaning something, repairing a small boat, dumping something harmless. But nothing felt right. There was a rigidity to him that felt deliberate, like he was aware of every sound and movement around him. I was suddenly hyper, aware of my own breathing, the slap of my sneakers against the damp path, and the low hum of my own heartbeat. I started to turn away, deciding it wasn't my business to investigate further. But as I moved, something made me glance back. The path behind me, which I had walked countless times, seemed different. The edges of the trail were overgrown with fallen leaves and encroaching grass, and I couldn't recognize exactly where I was. The familiar markers, the bends in the trail, the faint glow of city lights beyond the trees, were gone. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I told myself I had only wandered a little off course, that the fog was playing tricks on my eyes. Yet even as I reasoned it out, a gnawing sense of wrongness settled in. Then the man's head snapped up. Our eyes met through the haze, and he didn't flinch, didn't even blink. There was no expression, no movement other than his still gaze, but it was intense, focused, and it felt like it was drilling straight through me. My chest tightened. Every rational thought I had fled instantly, leaving only a desperate, pounding fear. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted, feet sliding on the wet leaves and uneven ground. My lungs burned, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, and yet I couldn't hear anything other than the echo of my own movement. I tried to navigate by memory, but every turn seemed unfamiliar. The fog closed in around me, thickening until I could barely see the path ahead. I tripped once over a tree root, barely catching myself before hitting the ground, and the splash of water somewhere nearby sounded unnervingly close. I told myself it was only the lake, only my imagination, but the rhythm of splashing seemed to follow me in sync with my frantic pace. Panic made my legs move faster, my mind grasping for a route out of the maze of fog-shrouded trails. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint glow ahead. It was a streetlight, distant and haloed in mist. The familiar yellow circle cutting through the gray around it. Relief surged through me, heavy and overwhelming. I stumbled toward it, brushing branches and wet leaves from my path, lungs screaming for oxygen. I reached the light and slowed. Catching my breath, my eyes straining back into the fog. I couldn't see him anymore. There was no sign of the man kneeling at the water's edge, no trace of the strange ripples I had witnessed. The lake, though still nearby, had returned to its usual quiet appearance, the water reflecting nothing but the dim light of the street lamp above. I lingered there for a moment, heart still racing, letting my eyes adjust to the light. My hand shook as I pulled my water bottle from my belt, sipping shakily. Gradually, the rational part of me returned. The man had to be someone who had lost something, or was cleaning up after a late night activity. The path had seemed overgrown because I had misjudged a turn. The fog, combined with exhaustion, had warped my perception. Still, the intensity of his gaze, the unnatural stillness, had left a mark that I couldn't shake. I decided to stick to the perimeter of the park, following the faint glow of the city lights rather than venturing back toward the lake. Every step was cautious, scanning the shadows, listening for any repeat of the sound that had followed me. Gradually, the familiar signs of the park at night reappeared, the faint outlines of other paths, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant murmur of traffic from the streets surrounding the park. My pulse slowly settled into something more manageable as I exited near Stanyan Street, the streetlights bright and reassuring compared to the gray gloom of the fog. Once outside the park, I paused on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath and letting the cold night air fill my lungs. The streets were empty, but the city noises felt normal again. The low hum of cars, the occasional shout or bark, the rhythm of life continuing as if nothing strange had happened. I looked back at the park, the fog now a distant gray veil behind the trees. The lake was hidden, but I could picture it still and quiet, the memory of the kneeling figure lingering in the corner of my mind. My legs still shook, my skin felt cold, but I knew I was safe, fully back in the city and away from the isolation of the trails. The next day, I checked the map of Stowe Lake, retracing my route in daylight. Everything made sense in the light of the sun. The path I thought had been overgrown was actually a small side trail I'd accidentally veered onto, hidden by the fog and darkness. The man by the lake. I never saw anyone there again, but imagining what he had been doing, the water rippling, the repetitive motion, was enough to keep me cautious on my nightly runs from then on. I didn't know if he had been dumping something, cleaning something, or just fixing a personal item, but I realized how much the combination of isolation, darkness, and fog could distort perception. I never ran Stowe Lake that late again. The fog, the quiet, the sensation of being watched even when rationally I knew I wasn't, it stayed with me. The city was supposed to feel safe, familiar, and predictable, but that night, the park had reminded me how quickly even familiar places could feel foreign and threatening. I started sticking to earlier runs. When other joggers were around, lights were on, and the world felt tangible and grounded. That sense of unease never fully left, but it faded with distance from the lake, leaving only a memory I could recount and a lesson learned sometimes the simplest explanation. Mistaken paths, shadows, human behavior can be as unsettling as anything imagined, especially when the night and the fog are working against you. It was a Saturday afternoon in late May, and the sun was warm but not oppressive, filtering softly through the thick canopy of trees in Hyde Park. The air carried that subtle mix of freshly cut grass and the faint tang of the serpentine, a combination that usually felt comforting, almost lazy. I had decided to come to the park for a quiet lunch, a chance to sit alone, eat, and let my mind wander away from the constant hum of work emails and the city outside. The park was mostly empty, which was unusual for a weekend, but I liked it that way. It made the space feel almost private, as though the long stretches of grass and paths belonged only to me. I walked along the path near the serpentine, taking in the gentle rippling of the water and the way the late spring sun made it sparkle. The usual joggers and dog walkers were scarce, and the benches scattered along the lakeside were largely unoccupied. I noticed one bench tucked a little behind a small rise, partially shaded by an old oak tree, and decided it would be a good spot. As I approached, I saw something odd: a picnic setup, abandoned or left behind. Plates with half-eaten sandwiches were still on the blanket, a bottle of wine sitting upright as though it had just been placed there, a few crumbs scattered around. The entire scene seemed frozen, untouched. The cutlery glinted faintly in the sunlight, and the paper napkins were stiff, slightly creased as if no one had moved them in days. I couldn't see any footprints around the blanket, no sign that anyone had returned recently, which made the whole arrangement feel uncanny rather than casual. I hesitated, the unease creeping in slowly. I wasn't usually bothered by empty picnic setups, but something about the stillness of this one made me tense. My eyes darted over the food again. The sandwiches were neatly cut, untouched by birds or squirrels. The wine bottle looked sealed, though I could not tell if it had been opened. The sunlight made everything look a little too crisp, the shadows a little too deep under the blanket. It was silent apart from the faint lap of water against the serpentine and the occasional distant bark of a dog. I reached for my phone to check the time and text someone, a habit I had, almost reflexive, but the screen read no signal. That struck me as impossible. Hyde Park was in central London. Coverage here was supposed to be perfect. I tried a few times, turning in slow circles, hoping my position was just bad, but there was nothing. The little bars refused to light up. My stomach tightened. A thought ran through my mind, absurd and sudden. Why would there be no signal here, in broad daylight, in one of the busiest cities in the world? I shook it off. Perhaps it was a temporary glitch, a quirk of my provider, but the feeling of being isolated had begun to take root. I leaned back on the bench and tried to ignore it, reaching for my own lunch. My bag was light, just a sandwich and an apple. I had unpacked it slowly, deliberately, and just as I was about to take a bite, I heard footsteps behind me. The sound was soft at first, tentative, but deliberate, distinct against the distant hum of the park. I froze, listening. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, coming closer, stopping, then resuming. I turned quickly, the instinct to confront, or at least see who it was kicking in, but the path behind me was empty. No one was there. I scanned the area, the benches, the slight rises in the grass, even the edge of the lake, but nothing. Only the ripple of water and the long shadows of trees stretched across the ground. My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise. There was no logical explanation, nothing to indicate that someone had been there and then vanished. I tried to breathe slowly, rationalizing, telling myself I had misheard, that perhaps it was a jogger a little way down the path, their footfalls echoing oddly on the hard ground. I turned back toward the picnic setup, hoping the familiarity of it would calm me. But when I looked, it was no longer as I had seen it. The sandwiches were gone, the plates cleared, the bottle of wine absent. In its place, on the center of the blanket, lay a single note, neatly folded and angled toward me. My stomach lurched. I reached out with a trembling hand, my eyes scanning the edges of the trees, the path, the water, for anyone watching. I unfolded the note slowly, the paper crisp and clean, and my eyes traced the words, "Don't look behind you." The handwriting was neat, almost indifferent in style, which made it all the more chilling. There was no name, no explanation, nothing that could provide context. Just those 5 words, simple, commanding, impossible to ignore. I felt my body tighten, every instinct screaming at me to run, to leave. I didn't look behind me. I couldn't. My mind filled with possibilities, none of them comforting. Someone had to be nearby, had to have left the note, had to be watching. The normalcy of the park, the soft light, the distant laughter of a few children playing near a far-off playground. All of it seemed staged, a contrast to the tight coil of fear in my chest. I gathered my things quickly, leaving my lunch entirely untouched. My steps were hurried but careful, not daring to glance over my shoulder, keeping my focus forward, on the path leading back toward the busier areas of the park. As I walked, my senses were heightened in ways I didn't know were possible in such a familiar place. The sound of a crow landing on a branch made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of a twig under my own foot, the faint scent of someone else's perfume carried on the wind. All of it felt magnified. I stuck to the main path, moving faster than I usually would, my eyes scanning every shadow. I reached the edge of the park where the foot traffic increased, where couples and groups were moving more casually, and I paused, finally allowing myself to take a breath. The tension didn't leave immediately, but at least I was no longer alone. I didn't go back that day. I couldn't. But the memory of the note and the vanished picnic lingered. The next morning I returned, hoping to rationalize everything, maybe even find an explanation. The sun was softer, the park returning to its usual rhythm. Families with strollers, joggers, and cyclists moved through the space without noticing anything unusual. I walked to the spot near the Serpentine, scanning carefully. But there was nothing. No blanket, no plates, no sandwiches, no bottle, no note. It was as if nothing had ever been there. The grass was unbroken, the dirt path smooth, and the small rise under the oak tree completely ordinary. I stood for a long time, taking in the scene, trying to reconcile my memory with reality. I considered the possibility that someone had been playing a cruel prank, but the precision and timing required, the fact that no one was visible before or after, seemed improbable. I walked the perimeter looking for footprints, discarded paper, anything, but there was nothing. The park felt ordinary again, safe, almost dull, though the echo of fear lingered in my chest. I realized that sometimes the mind notices things the world has long since removed, or perhaps there had been someone else, briefly, and then gone. Eventually, I left, walking slowly back toward the city, feeling the soft warmth of the morning sun on my face. The park was normal again, the Serpentine glimmering under the gentle light. I had no explanation, no evidence to share, no one to confirm what I had experienced. And yet, the memory remained vivid, a quiet reminder that even in familiar places, even in the center of a city, the unexpected and unsettling can appear perfectly real and inexplicable, and disappear just as suddenly, leaving only the residue of unease. I never went back to that particular spot, not even on subsequent visits, and I still think of it sometimes when I pass through Hyde Park. The thought is simple sometimes, a place can feel empty, quiet, safe, and for a fleeting moment, it is not. I was cycling along the seawall in Stanley Park around 5 in the evening in August. The air was warm but not hot, with a faint, salty breeze coming off the water that mixed with the smell of the evergreens from the forest edge. The path was relatively quiet. A few pedestrians were scattered here and there, walking dogs or taking slow strolls along the shoreline, and the light was soft, tinged with gold as the sun began to drop toward the horizon. I was moving at a steady pace, enjoying the rhythm of my pedals and the sound of the tires rolling over the slightly rough concrete, trying to let the week's tension melt away. A cyclist overtook me quickly, coming up from behind, riding aggressively, all black with a sleek helmet, the type you see on people who are serious about speed. I barely gave it a second thought, assuming they were just training or trying to squeeze in one last lap before the sun went down. The movement of their bike blurred slightly in my vision as they passed, but nothing about it struck me as unusual at the time. A few minutes later, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned slightly and saw the same cyclist again, but this time heading toward me from the opposite direction. There was no pause, no stop, no turn. They just came at me, riding as if they had never gone past me at all. My stomach dropped. I slowed my speed, trying to convince myself it was some trick of perspective or timing, that maybe it was another cyclist dressed the same way. But as they passed by, I recognized the outline of their posture, the shape of their bike. It was the same. My mind began to tighten, a creeping tension growing behind my ribs. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the path looped in a way I wasn't remembering. Maybe I had misjudged where I had seen them the first time. I looked ahead and behind, but the path was mostly clear, empty except for the scattered pedestrians. I told myself to relax, to keep riding, to treat it like a coincidence. I tried to focus on the sound of the water lapping against the rocks below, on the way the sunlight played off the waves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my calm had been interrupted. By the third time, my unease had grown into a gnawing alarm. I saw the black-clad figure approach once more, riding toward me, but I had already stopped near a bench overlooking the water, my hands gripping the handlebars tightly, my heart beginning to race. The cyclists did not slow or alter their path. They passed by, and then, as if they had sensed my attention, they turned sharply off the seawall path onto a narrow forest trail that led into the trees, a path I had never noticed before despite having cycled this section of the park countless times. I watched them disappear almost instantly into the dense shadows, the contrast between the bright open path and the dark, enclosed trail making it impossible to follow visually. I waited there, stationary, watching the entrance to the forest path. The minutes stretched long, the soft hum of the city beyond the trees muted by the park's canopy. I noticed the way the wind moved differently here, brushing through the branches in low, whispering swishes, how the late afternoon sun slanted through the leaves in streaks of gold and green. I tried to focus on the familiar details, the gentle rocking of the water, the scattered pieces of litter near the bench, the distant hum of traffic, but it was impossible to ignore the absence of the cyclist. It had been nearly an hour, and nothing emerged from that trail. The forest seemed solid and indifferent, as if nothing at all could move through it without my seeing. Eventually, I forced myself back onto my bike, pedaling slowly at first, my eyes darting to every shadow along the path. I convinced myself that it had been nothing more than a trick of timing, that the cyclist had looped back around, or that there had been a second person coincidentally dressed the same way. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the prickling sensation at the back of my neck didn't fade. Every sound, the scrape of a branch, the distant bark of a dog, the soft crack of a rock under a pedestrian's shoe, felt amplified. The path that normally felt open and welcoming now seemed tight, the corners sharper, the shadows deeper than they should have been. I increased my speed, keeping my focus on the straight line ahead. The seawall curved gently, giving occasional glimpses of the water, the sky streaked with the warm tones of approaching dusk. I noticed details I usually didn't, the jagged edge of a broken concrete barrier, a cluster of seagulls settling on a rock, the faint spray of water hidden the path below. My heart slowed only slightly as I moved farther from the point where the forest trail intersected the seawall. It was impossible to tell if anyone was following, if the cyclist had reemerged behind me, or if the whole experience had been some strange illusion created by fatigue and sunlight. The uncertainty, the not knowing, was what lingered the most. As I reached the northern end of the seawall, where the path opens into wider parkland and the crowds thicken, I began to feel a small measure of relief. The visibility improved, there were people around again, joggers, other cyclists, parents with children. The air seemed clearer, the park's normal sounds, laughter, the slap of tennis balls from nearby courts, the hum of city traffic, returning to a comforting level. I stopped again at a familiar lookout, taking in the view of the harbor, the boats gently swaying, the mountains in the distance catching the last of the sunlight. My hands were still gripping the handlebars tightly, but I allowed myself to take a few deep breaths, trying to ground my racing mind. I took stock of the experience. Nothing had been overtly threatening. The cyclist had never approached me aggressively. There had been no words, no sudden movement toward me beyond the passing. Yet the pattern, the repeated sightings, the appearance and disappearance onto a path that led nowhere visible, the sense of being observed, had created a tension that was inescapable. The park, usually a place of comfort, had felt suddenly unpredictable, every detail amplified. Eventually, I resumed cycling, this time deliberately keeping to sections of the path where other people were present, making mental notes of each turn and intersection. I allowed myself to think about the rational possibilities: a skilled cyclist training in loops, a friend of someone else on the path with an identical bike, and clothing, the way shadows and light can play tricks on the eye. I told myself the experience had been unsettling but explainable. By the time I returned to my apartment, the sun had set fully, the streets and sidewalks alive with evening activity. I locked my bike, feeling a faint aftershock of tension in my chest. The encounter stayed with me in the days afterward, not as a fear that dominated my life, but as a quiet reminder that even familiar places can shift unexpectedly, that perception can be unreliable, and that the mind, even in daylight and open space, is capable of conjuring unease from the smallest inconsistencies. I returned to the seawall a few days later, during a busier time, and cycled without incident, keeping an eye on the usual corners and trails. It was ordinary again. The park had not changed, only my perception had. I accepted that, and in doing so, the memory of the black-clad cyclist became simply a strange, vivid moment, a puzzle of timing, light, and movement. One I would always remember, fully grounded in the reality of the park and the natural rhythm of a late summer evening. It was late October, just after 7 in the evening, and the air carried that sharp edge that always comes when fall is settling in fully. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving a dull, cold glow across Lincoln Park. The leaves, brittle and brown, rattled softly underfoot with each small gust of wind. I had taken my niece to the playground while her parents ran errands, thinking a short visit before dinner would be harmless. The park was nearly empty, which wasn't unusual for that hour, but it gave the place a strange quietness, the kind that made the distant sounds of traffic from the nearby streets seem oddly muted and far away. As soon as we reached the playground, I noticed him. A man, sitting on the swings near the edge of the play area. He didn't move, didn't swing, didn't even glance in our direction at first. He just sat there, hunched slightly, staring in our general direction. I assumed he was waiting for someone or just lost in his own thoughts, so I turned my attention back to my niece. She immediately ran toward the small slide, the sound of her shoes crunching over scattered leaves, breaking the unnatural stillness. I watched her carefully, my attention divided between keeping her safe and keeping an eye on the man. It was when she started climbing onto the slide that I noticed him again. This time, he had begun to rock slowly back and forth on the swing, almost imperceptibly at first. His movements were deliberate, not playful. His head tilted slightly forward, lips moving as if he were whispering to himself. I didn't hear any words, but the sound of someone muttering under their breath in the quiet park was jarring. My stomach tightened. I told myself to calm down, that there was nothing unusual about someone quietly talking to themselves on a swing, but the feeling of being watched began to creep up my spine. My niece stopped mid-climb and looked back at him. Her expression changed from excitement to a slight confusion. She asked me who he was, her small voice carrying across the empty playground. I felt a sudden, sharp need to get us out of there. I scooped her up, feeling her weight press against me, and started walking toward the nearest exit. That's when I noticed it. He was moving. Slowly, deliberately, he got up from the swings and began following us. He didn't hurry, didn't run, but he kept pace, staying a few steps behind us. The leaves crunched under our feet, louder than before, yet every other sound in the park seemed muted, like the world had folded around this single, tense moment. We moved quickly along the path that led to the street, weaving between lampposts that cast long shadows on the asphalt. Each time I looked over my shoulder, he was there, not sprinting, not acting erratic, just keeping that steady, silent pace. He didn't speak, didn't call out, but the fact that he was following us without reason made my chest tighten with a kind of dread I couldn't shake. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. The park wasn't far from residential streets. Someone could see if he did anything, and yet he didn't stop, didn't even glance toward anyone else. It was as though he existed only for the purpose of following us. My niece squirmed a little in my arms, sensing my tension. I tried to ignore the chill that ran up my spine, and focused on the sound of our own footsteps and the crunch of leaves. The street finally came into view. I could see the faint glow of streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement. Relief began to settle over me, though it was tinged with unease. We were almost to safety, almost to the place where I could call her parents. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze had been burned into the back of my neck. I kept moving, quickening my pace as best I could without alarming my niece. Once we reached the street, I stopped near a bench where I could set her down for a moment. I fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling more than I wanted to admit. The call connected quickly, and I heard her parents' familiar voices on the other end. They asked where we were, and I explained as calmly as possible, though my voice carried that low, taut edge that happens when adrenaline won't let go. While I spoke, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him emerge from the shadows, waiting, still following us. But he was gone, just like that, as if he had never been there. No swing creaked, no movement in the shadows, nothing but the sound of the evening wind and the distant hum of traffic. Even after he disappeared, the feeling didn't leave me. Walking back home with my niece safely in my arms, I noticed every shadow a little longer, every rustle of leaves a little sharper. I replayed the moment over and over in my head. The slow, deliberate way he had followed us, the quiet muttering to himself, the calm patience in his movements. It didn't make sense, and that made it worse. There was no threat that I could identify, no attempt to harm us, yet the intention was clear in the way he moved. It wasn't playful, it wasn't casual. It was a quiet, persistent presence, watching, tracking, waiting. At home, after we were safely inside, I made sure to lock all the doors and close the blinds. I stayed near her while she ate her snack, my mind wandering back to that empty park and the man on the swing. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't have a description that felt useful. He was an ordinary man in ordinary clothes, doing something that was ordinary enough on the surface, yet deeply unsettling in practice. Instead, I made a mental note to avoid the park in the evening. From then on, to be more aware, to never underestimate the quietness that hides a watchful presence. By the time her parents returned, the tension had eased just slightly, replaced with a careful, simmering alertness. I told them about the man, the way he had followed us, and they nodded, understanding without judgment. There was no grand conclusion, no dramatic capture, no confrontation. The man hadn't done anything overtly dangerous, yet the weight of his observation lingered. I realized that sometimes the scariest moments aren't the ones with action or immediate threat. They are the ones where you feel completely seen and powerless, where a stranger's quiet attention can unsettle the very air around you. Even now, thinking back, I remember the way he sat on that swing, the slow rhythm of his rocking, the low murmurs and the emptiness around him. I remember the crunch of leaves under our feet, the faint glow of the streetlight, and the unmistakable, cold awareness of being followed. And I know, even if I never saw him again, that for a brief, tense half hour, he had held a space in my mind and my memory, an unshakable reminder of how vulnerable you can feel in a place that should feel safe, and how someone can turn a quiet evening into an experience that lingers far beyond the park's boundaries. It was around 10:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Millennium Park was quieter than I had ever seen it. The usual hum of late, night traffic and distant city noise seemed muffled under the thick, almost tangible calm that had settled over the park. I had gone out for a jog, something I usually did to clear my mind after a long day at work. But tonight the streets felt different, empty in a way that made the city feel miles away. The lights along the paths cast pale pools on the asphalt, barely enough to illuminate the cracks and scattered leaves that had fallen from the trees lining the trail. I kept a steady pace, the rhythm of my feet against the ground echoing softly in the emptiness, and I noticed that most of the joggers I usually passed were gone, leaving me almost entirely alone. After a while, my legs started to protest against the miles I had already covered. I slowed and spotted a bench tucked off to the side of the main path, in a small clearing surrounded by hedges that had grown a little wild. It was the sort of place I had passed many times, but had never noticed before, obscured slightly by the shadow of a large oak and a thicket of bushes. I decided to rest for a minute, wiping the sweat from my brow and feeling the cool air brush across my skin. The smell of damp earth and grass mixed with the faint scent of the lake nearby. The park at night had its own texture, different from the daylight, a quiet density that pressed in on you in subtle ways. I lowered myself onto the bench, letting my shoulders relax for the first time in hours. That's when I noticed him. A man sat at the other end of the same bench. He was alone, completely still, staring straight ahead. He had no phone, no bag, no drink, nothing. Just himself and the darkness around him. I felt an immediate jolt of awareness, that instinctive spike of alertness you get when something feels slightly off, even if you can't explain why. I couldn't read his expression properly in the dim light, but the way he leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed in my direction, made my stomach knot. I tried to look casual, pretending I hadn't noticed him, even though my pulse was quickening. I sat there for a few minutes, keeping my head down, glancing sideways just enough to see him. Every now and then, I adjusted my position, thinking maybe he was just another late-night visitor, someone waiting for a friend or resting after a jog. But there was nothing about him that made sense. No movement beyond the slight lean of his upper body. No sighing, no shifting, no subtle indications of comfort or fatigue. It was just the stillness, the way his presence felt too precise, too deliberate. I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe I was letting the quiet and my imagination get the better of me. Eventually, I stood up, brushing off my shorts and stretching my legs. My heart was still thumping, and I walked slowly along the path, telling myself that once I had put a few dozen feet between us, I could glance back and he would just be another late-night park goer who had walked away. But when I finally did look back, my stomach sank. The bench was empty. Not only that, there were no footprints in the soft ground around it, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The leaves on the path and under the bench were undisturbed, not even a hint of compression from a weight that had been resting there moments ago. It was as if he had been there 1 second and gone the next, leaving nothing behind. I stopped walking and scanned the clearing, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The oak tree loomed overhead, casting long, flickering shadows in the weak glow of the streetlight. The hedges rustled softly in the wind, and somewhere nearby, water lapped quietly against the edge of the lake. I told myself I must have imagined it, that maybe my eyes had caught a shadow in a strange alignment, or a trick of light on the bench. I stepped forward, crouching slightly to inspect the ground, tracing the area with my eyes. There was nothing, not even the faintest indentation that suggested someone had been sitting there. The emptiness felt heavier after that. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car horn, even the occasional bark of a dog somewhere off the path seemed louder, sharper, more intimate. I began to walk faster, circling the area, and trying to convince myself that what I had seen didn't matter, that it had been nothing. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I would catch sight of him again, some corner of the park where he had gone to hide. But there was nothing. Only the park, dimly lit, quiet, and impossibly still. I moved away from the clearing, sticking to the main paths this time, forcing myself to keep a steady pace. My mind replayed the moment over and over, and I couldn't shake the sensation of his eyes on me, even though there had been no actual acknowledgement, no movement beyond that slight lean. It wasn't fear in the conventional sense, more a creeping unease, the sort that doesn't scream but lodges itself deep in your chest. I realized that part of what had unsettled me so much was the normalcy of it. There was nothing overtly threatening about him. No weapon, no loud behavior, no aggression. Just presence. That silent, human presence that seemed aware of me in a way that was impossible to escape. By the time I reached the other side of the park, closer to the streets that still buzzed faintly with traffic, my body had loosened, but the memory lingered. I took one last glance back toward the clearing where the bench had been, half expecting to see him seated there again. Nothing. The bench sat empty under the faint glow of a streetlight, as if nothing had happened. I made a mental note to tell myself it was just fatigue or my mind playing tricks, and forced my pace all the way back to my apartment. That night, lying in bed, I reviewed the moment again and again, trying to rationalize it. The only explanation that made sense in the daylight of my mind was that I had seen a man who had been sitting very still, that I had stood up and he had left, and that somehow, because of the soft ground and the scattered leaves, there was no sign of his departure. Perhaps he had slipped away quietly, blending into the shadows and foliage, or maybe he had been a jogger who had crouched or ducked into the underbrush and remained unseen. The more I thought about it, the more mundane the solution became, and yet the image of that still, empty bench remained. I returned to Millennium Park the next morning in daylight, just to see the bench in a completely different context. The clearing looked ordinary, the bench worn but unremarkable, the hedges neatly trimmed along the sides. Joggers passed me without notice, and the usual sounds of the city returned, filling in the spaces where the quiet had been the night before. I sat there for a few minutes, taking in the scene, and though my pulse quickened at first, I gradually recognized that there was nothing unusual about it now. The man had gone. He had left. Whatever had unsettled me had a perfectly logical explanation. Someone had been there, and then someone had left. That simple truth carried a strange weight of relief, a satisfaction in knowing that the moment was bounded, explainable, and ultimately harmless. Even now, I still remember the lean, the quiet, the way his eyes seemed to follow me without moving. But the park had returned to its normal rhythm. The city noises filled the gaps, and I understood that not everything strange is dangerous, not every odd presence is a threat. Some things simply happen, and the world continues, leaving only a memory of unease and the quiet reassurance that it, too, has passed. I went for a walk around Prospect Park Lake in early September, just as the sun was dipping toward the horizon. The air had that late summer weight, warm against my skin but tinged with the first hint of coolness that comes with shorter days. Shadows were stretching across the paths, long and thin, and the water of the lake caught the fading light, reflecting streaks of orange and pink that gradually dimmed as the minutes passed. It was quiet, quieter than usual for a weekday evening, as though the park itself was holding its breath. I had walked this route many times, and I knew the gentle curve of the path along the lake, the way the trees leaned over the water, the occasional benches where people paused to take in the view. Today, the calm felt almost fragile. As I rounded the bend near the west side, where the path runs close to the water, I noticed a man sitting on a large, flat rock near the edge of the lake. He was alone, slouched slightly, with his knees drawn up, holding a camera in front of him. He wasn't taking pictures, at least not in any obvious way. His eyes seemed fixed on the view in front of him, but something about the stillness felt wrong. I slowed my pace for a moment, just to glance at him more closely. The camera was held lightly, his finger hovering near the shutter, but the lens pointed at nothing in particular, toward the water and the tree line beyond. I told myself he was just waiting for a good shot. Maybe someone else would come by, and I started walking again, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Almost immediately I heard it, the soft, mechanical click of a camera shutter. At first I thought it was coming from somewhere else, maybe a couple taking pictures closer to the path, but the sound was too consistent and too near. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. The man on the rock had moved. He was closer now, crouched low, holding the camera in the same position, aimed in my direction. He wasn't taking pictures in the way people normally do. He was just clicking. The sound was methodical, deliberate, echoing faintly across the water. I couldn't see any flash from the camera, only the repeated motion of the shutter and the small rhythm it made. I walked faster, my shoes crunching against the gravel path, my pulse picking up. My mind tried to reason it out. Maybe he was practicing. Maybe it was a different kind of camera. Maybe I was overreacting. But the sound followed me, unmistakable, persistent. It wasn't the normal sporadic shudder of a tourist or hobbyist. Each click was measured, precise, and it seemed to synchronize with the pace of my steps. I glanced behind me again. He had moved again, following the curve of the path along the lake. Not running, not overtly, just moving with that same careful, silent step, keeping the camera aimed at me, clicking at intervals I couldn't predict. My stomach churned. The park, which had felt open and calm a moment ago, suddenly seemed tight and narrow, the trees leaning closer as I moved along the path. The light was fading faster now, orange giving way to a dusky gray. The lake's reflection became dimmer, the ripples catching what little color remained. I tried to keep my breathing steady, reminding myself I had walked here before, that this path led directly to the main exit. I wasn't lost. I wasn't alone in a remote area. But the clicking behind me made every step feel heavy, and I realized my muscles had tensed without me noticing. My hands had started to sweat, and I found myself clenching my fists, gripping the straps of my backpack, as if that would somehow protect me. The sound of the shutter echoed, unnaturally in the quiet of the evening, bouncing off the water and into my ears, creating a rhythm that didn't match the natural environment. Birds chirped from the trees in scattered bursts, a dog barked somewhere near the road, but nothing else. Nothing moved along the path except for me and the man. I tried to focus on anything else. The way the water moved gently against the shore, the faint rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic beyond the park. I told myself he would stop soon, that he might leave the path and return to wherever he had come from. But the clicking persisted. My pace quickened again, and I felt a spike of panic as the path curved slightly and the exit gate came into view. It was just ahead, visible through the thinning trees, bathed in the last remnants of sunlight. Relief surged, though it was tinged with a sharp edge of fear. I dared to glance back one more time. The rock where he had first been sitting was empty. No one was crouched along the path. The camera was gone. The man had disappeared as if he had melted into the shadows of the trees. The lake, once alive with color, now reflected only gray streaks of fading sunlight, the water calm and undisturbed. I stopped for a moment near the exit, trying to steady my breath and calm the pounding in my chest. My skin tingled from head to toe, every nerve ending screaming that something had been off, that I had been watched, tracked, measured in those final minutes along the water. But there was no one, nothing to see, just the quiet of the park settling around me. I walked through the gate slowly, taking my time to leave the path, scanning the edges of the park where the trees thickened, half expecting to see him again. But there was only the empty stretch of sidewalk, the faint buzz of streetlights flickering to life, and the distant cars moving along the avenues beyond. The city felt loud and familiar in contrast, alive in a way that made the park seem smaller, less threatening, almost unreal after what had happened. I realized I was trembling slightly, my hands still sweaty, my back tight, but I forced myself to take a few deep breaths. I had made it out. He hadn't followed me beyond the park. The clicking had stopped. The sense of being tracked, watched, had ended the moment I reached the street. The relief was immediate, tangible grounding. I continued walking along the sidewalk, taking deliberate steps away from the park. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the way he had shifted closer without me noticing, the deliberate click of the shutter, the feeling that someone had been just behind me the entire way. It was unnerving, almost surreal, and yet every detail was so vivid, so grounded in the real world. There were no shadows that moved unnaturally, no figures appearing from nowhere. He had been a person, a real person, sitting and following, and then gone. That was what made it so disquieting. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't imagined. It was a real interaction, brief and silent, that left me shaken without a single word exchanged. By the time I reached the corner, where the nearest subway entrance glowed under the streetlights, I felt the tension in my body begin to ease. The city absorbed me back into its rhythm. The noise of cars, the hum of conversation from late diners, the occasional shout or laughter. It was ordinary life resuming, and yet I carried the residue of the park's stillness with me, the memory of being observed, the sense of being carefully, silently followed. I knew I wouldn't forget it. I knew I would walk that path again, eventually, but it would be with a heightened awareness, a lingering caution. Looking back at Prospect Park Lake as I descended into the subway, I saw it in my mind's eye exactly as it had been. The quiet water, the stretch of trees, the fading sunlight. But now every detail was colored by the awareness of how close someone had been, how real the threat of observation had felt. I understood that this was one of those experiences that could linger long after the immediate danger had passed. The park had returned to its calm state by the time I left, indifferent to what had happened, but I knew the memory would carry that evening with me for a long time. I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease, a quiet satisfaction in having made it out safely, and an awareness that not every encounter in a public place is as harmless as it seems. I was unharmed, and I was out, and for that I was grateful. Even if the memory would remain vivid every time, I thought of that stretch of the path along the lake. I decided to take a late afternoon hike through Rock Creek Park, aiming for the nature trail near P Street. It was early November, and the air had that sharp, cold bite that hinted winter was just around the corner. The trees were mostly bare now, their skeletal branches reaching toward the fading sky. I had passed the posted closure sign without giving it much thought. The park wasn't crowded at this hour, and I figured I could make it to the far side of the trail before the last light faded. It seemed like a simple misjudgment of time, nothing more, and I always liked the feeling of having the woods to myself. The first part of the trail was familiar, wide and lined with leaves that crunched under my boots. Joggers and dog walkers had all gone home, leaving only the occasional bird sound or the distant hum of traffic from the city beyond. I felt a quiet relief in the solitude, the kind that comes from being fully alone without distraction. The further I walked, the narrower the trail became. The brush started to encroach, twigs scraping against my jacket as I pushed through. The sounds of the city fell away entirely. No distant car horns, no footsteps echoing on pavement, nothing but the wind through the dry leaves and my own breathing. At some point, I noticed the trail wasn't just narrowing, it was almost overgrown. Branches reached across my path, fallen leaves had turned into a thick, slippery carpet, and roots jutted out unexpectedly, forcing me to watch every step. My pace slowed naturally, a caution bred from uneven footing and shadows that seemed darker as the sun dipped lower. I told myself it was just the park being quiet, just the natural way of the woods settling into evening. Then I heard it, a rustling behind me. At first, I thought it might be a squirrel or some other small animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too measured, like footsteps on dirt and leaves. I paused and listened, straining to place the sound. It stopped, then started again a few seconds later. Each step was light but persistent, following me in a rhythm that unnerved me. I told myself I was imagining it, that the woods simply carried sound strangely, but my stomach tightened into knots. I picked up my pace. My boots crunched loudly over the fallen leaves, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. Every now and then I glanced back. At first, nothing. Just trees in the fading light, shadows stretching long and dark. Then, on one glance, I saw a shape moving between two trees. It wasn't clear, only a dark blur, but my mind instantly recognized the form as human. I turned quickly, and it vanished. My stomach sank. I had no idea if anyone was actually there or if I was being paranoid, but the trail suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as though the trees themselves were closing in. I started jogging, trying to maintain a steady rhythm, my eyes darting constantly to the edges of the trail. Every now and then, a leaf would snap under some hidden weight, a subtle shift that made me break into a faster pace. My lungs burned in the cold air, but I didn't want to stop. The trail was twisting now, taking me further from the main path. I could feel my anxiety building with each step. The overgrowth scraped at my legs, snagging my jacket, slowing me just slightly, but that was all it took for me to feel exposed. The footsteps behind me didn't match mine. They didn't land in the same rhythm, didn't match the uneven ground. They were softer in places, heavier in others. Sometimes I thought they were farther away than they should have been, then closer again without me having run a corresponding distance. I couldn't tell if someone was trying to keep up with me, or just mirroring my movements, staying just out of reach. My brain raced, cataloging every option, every way I could have misjudged it. Maybe someone was lost like me. Maybe it was someone with malicious intent. Maybe it wasn't human at all, and the woods were playing tricks on my senses. The sun was dipping below the horizon now, leaving only a deep, cold twilight. Shadows pooled beneath the trees, and the world felt compressed, claustrophobic. My breathing had become ragged, and sweat prickled under my layers despite the chill. I kept turning my head, scanning the trail behind me, seeing nothing but dark shapes and the occasional movement of leaves, as if some unseen hand was brushing through them. Each time I thought I'd convinced myself there was no one, a subtle snap behind me would restart the panic, and I'd pick up speed again. At one point, the trail curved sharply, leading me down a narrow incline covered in fallen branches and loose dirt. My boots slipped, and I caught myself on a tree, heart pounding, thinking I might have fallen if I'd lost my balance completely. Behind me, I heard it again, a quiet rustle, almost like someone stepping carefully to avoid making noise, and yet they weren't slowing down. I broke into a run, not caring about the slipping leaves or the branches scraping my arms. My pulse was deafening in my ears. Every sense narrowed to one singular thought: get to the road, get out of the woods. The incline ended at a small clearing, and I could see the main road ahead. Streetlights glowed weakly through the trees, casting a pale, artificial light that made the darkness of the woods beyond feel absolute. Relief surged through me, but I didn't slow down. My eyes darted to the trail behind me, now fading into dense shadows. For a split second, I saw a figure, just a shape, a shadow between trees, but it was gone when I blinked. The clearing was empty, and the only tracks were my own, heavy and hurried. I stumbled onto the road, collapsing against the curb, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The traffic on the main street felt overwhelmingly loud, the lights too bright, the city smells too strong. My legs were trembling from the run, and my heart still thudded painfully. I looked back at the trail. In the fading light, it seemed completely deserted, normal, harmless. Yet the flattened grass, the disturbed leaves, the marks on the soft earth showed me unmistakably that I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been behind me, close enough to step where I had just been, close enough that I felt their presence in my peripheral vision, and then vanished without a trace once I reached safety. I didn't linger. I walked quickly along the sidewalk, heading toward the nearest bus stop, trying to let the sound of the city settle me, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a jogger who had started late, maybe someone else walking a trail, maybe a hiker who hadn't wanted to be seen. Every explanation was plausible, every rational thought possible, but the image of that shadow and the sound of footsteps that appeared and disappeared kept looping in my mind. I told myself I would never ignore closure signs again. The park could feel peaceful and quiet, even empty, but that evening reminded me that it wasn't just the nature I had to respect. It was the unknown people, moving silently through it, who could unsettle even the most familiar paths. By the time I reached the bus stop and climbed aboard, the city felt normal again, lights and movement and noise filling every corner. My muscles ached from tension, my hands still trembled slightly, and my chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. I had made it out without confrontation, without injury, without knowing exactly who or what had been behind me, and that strangely made it feel more real, more dangerous. Not the wild animals, not some supernatural presence, but a person unseen until too late, moving quietly and deliberately. That thought stayed with me for days afterward, shaping the way I approached every park trail, every moment of quiet in the woods, and teaching me the hardest lesson about solitude. It can feel safe until it isn't, and the safest path is the one clearly marked.